Professor Azmanova, thank you so very much for joining our interview. Let me start with the first question. In your analysis in the article published in 2019 entitled The Paradox of Emancipation, Populism, Democracy, and the Soul of the Left, you mentioned the left's struggle to harness anti-establishment energies and channel them into leftist politics despite the fertile ground created by the Great Recession. Could you elaborate on specific shortcomings in the left's response to the rise of populism and how the phenomenon of democratic prejudice might be impeding its effectiveness in appealing to voters?
So the famous democratic prejudice of Nietzsche, which I believe indeed it is blinding us to give the right diagnosis of the time. So let me explain that. Now, Nietzsche observed that we, people in the modern West, tend to reflect. We have this reflex to read history as the progressive advent of democracy and its crisis. So there is the democracy that advances, there's a crisis, and we have to restore democracy. But this is a rather conservative intuition about history, because we always have to repair in a way, to go back, even as we go forward. So I think that the left currently views the damage done by neoliberalism, that is all the politics of labor market liberalization and product liberalization, opening of the economies, that policy package of deregulation, privatization, liberalization of the economy. They see the damage in terms of creating a more inequality and the damage to democracy. So we have to save democracy by fighting inequality. That is like the typical adage, the typical a response of the left. So let's fight inequality. We have so much talk about fighting inequality. Even whole degrees in universities exist now, master's degree in inequality studies. So we therefore endeavor to recover our healing, our ailing societies through a policy set that reminds us of the glorious times of the welfare state, where there was this inclusive prosperity, less inequality, a lot of policies of inclusion through growth and redistribution. But that's a nostalgic instinct to go back to the familiar and to propose, the typical left solutions. That we have also a lot of the rhetoric of class struggle with the tax the rich. So all these old diagnoses and old solutions. So I think this is preventing us to see how exactly the world has changed, how our societies have changed, and actually what harms common people is of different order, of different nature. So I have concluded in my research that insecurity and not inequality so much. I mean, inequality is a problem in itself, but what really ails people and what troubles people is this massive insecurity where we see everywhere. To take a practical example, if you notice the state, and I have written about that, where Trump made inroads into the working class in 2016. And those states were Alaska, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Utah, Michigan, I might be forgetting some. So actually the smallest increases in inequality nationwide since 1989. But those were states where the economies were troubled because they had not generated good and stable employment. So what is new is a central element, a central driver of this insecurity is fear of job loss. So even people who are still employed, so it's not only about the unemployed, but even people with good jobs, good employment, good pay, good salaries, they live under permanent fear of job loss. And that was very tangible already back 20 years ago with the Polish plumber mobilization in France against the European Constitution in 2005. That was simply the fear of French workers that the cheaper labor from Eastern Europe would come and take away their jobs, their job security, their pay. So there would be social dumping as a result of that. So this is my understanding of the current situation. And then with this diagnosis, we have to have different policies, different also solutions.
Right. In your article titled Precarity, Populism, and Prospects for a Green Democratic Transformation, you assert that left populism would finally be able to eclipse the xenophobic, exclusionary right-wing populism and offer a constructive alternative to neoliberal capitalism. Considering the current global trend of a rise in the far-right parties, not only in Europe, but across the globe, how do you envision the realization of this prophecy?
Well, unfortunately, it's not a prophecy in the sense of prediction. It is an advice. It's an advice to so-called progressive forces to address what really ails people. That is massive economic insecurity. And if because now the right is responding to this fear of insecurity, fear of job loss, fear of loss of livelihoods, with policies of physical security. There's more crackdown on, there's more surveillance, there's more police, there's more, stopping immigration. So this kind of, they respond to this fear with stabilization policy, but not economic stabilization. So what the left needs to do is actually focus on stabilization policies, speak about stability. And it needs to appeal to much broader part of the population than its typical electorate, because this economic insecurity is actually affecting almost everybody. The middle classes for sure, the professional classes, the even upper middle classes. So the class struggle cannot capture that. I mean, see the protesting farmers nowadays, or the yellow vests. The people who were on the streets back then were not just the working class; they were property owners. They were just very concerned with the incapacity to manage their lives with all the pressures they're facing.
In the article,
so again, not a prophecy, but a strategy.
All right. In the article, you introduced the term precarity. Could you provide a clear definition of what precarity is and elucidate how its dynamics intersect with populism?
Yes. So precarity is a very special form of insecurity. I use that not very pretty term exactly because I want to draw attention to the fact that it is not exactly the unpredictability, the insecurity, the uncertainty of modern life, but it's a very special form of disempowerment that is politically produced. So it's, if you wish, it is an insecurity, but it's not just any cannot equate it with uncertainty. So I speak of precarity as such disempowerment that is rooted in politically produced threats to livelihoods, lives, and to cultural life worlds. But nowadays, people I believe, are mostly concerned with these threats to their livelihoods, their sources of income. as jobs become, even if in conditions of low unemployment, jobs become more and more insecure. And also pressures on the job for job holders increase. So I understand precarity mostly expressed in this incapacity to cope. And that incapacity to cope is rooted in a discrepancy between what we need to do, or the responsibilities that are piling up, and our capacity to deliver on those responsibilities, to carry them out. Like we have growing obligations, but deficient resources and deficient abilities to fulfill them. For instance, in academia, academics are asked to do more and more teaching and more administrative work, and even student recruitment, for which we're not equipped, we're not trained to do that. So you live with this thing, you have to publish more and more, you have to teach more and more, and you have to do also work for which you're not qualified, simply because it is cheaper for the universities to pressure us, the workers, to do more for less. So this mechanism of misalignment between our duties or work pressures and the resources, our resources and capacity to deliver on them, is creating this massive incapacity to cope. And in that sense, we can also speak about that people with good jobs, that is, well-paid, good jobs, more or less protected jobs, that's like doctors and nurses, are precarious in the sense that they have such pressures for which they're poorly equipped to deliver. So precarity, then, if we understand it like this politically generated disempowerment, affects not only our pockets, our material well-being, but also the psychological welfare of people. But it also works on societal level. It harms society's capacity to manage adversity, to manage its challenges, to manage crisis, and therefore to govern ourselves. I believe that this is why the medical crisis with COVID turned actually into a social crisis, because our public services were underfunded, the healthcare was underfunded, and it could not cope with these pressures, because the funding for healthcare had been thinning out over the past decades gradually. So our hospitals were not equipped to cope with that, but generally, the healthcare sector was experienced this incapacity to cope because of specific policies that had left to them. Of course, you can experience the incapacity to cope if natural disaster happens, right? But our particular incapacity to cope was generated by these neoliberal policies that cut funding for social services in order to make our economies, so to speak, more competitive in the global economy.
All right. In your book, Capitalism on Edge, you assert a straightforward proposition that the present state of capitalist democracy harbors a discernible potential for subverting capitalism itself. Can you delve deeper into the specifics of this claim? Are we witnessing the culmination of capitalist democracy as it has been understood so far? And what implications does this hold for liberal democracies?
So two things to note, to bear in mind, to understand, the good news in my analysis, in a way, because it's very depressing with all this ubiquitous, omnipresent precarity. But I find a reason for hope in the combination of two things. First, to bear in mind that this insecurity, precarity, is politically produced by specific politics, mostly the politics that are dominated by the imperative for competitiveness in the globally integrated market economy. And if they're politically produced, they can be politically undone. So it is not just the general insecurity that we have to just become more resilient against that insecurity. No, we can undo the politics and the policies that are generating precarity. The second point is, as I mentioned, that it affects almost everyone. It's just not the working class, it's not the poor. But as I like to, put it bluntly, even the successful hate their lives in this context because of the pressures, because they cannot enjoy the life that they would normally love, that they're educated to enjoy, the life of leisure and friendships and travel, because of these fears of job loss and work pressures. So there is a big alliance there in society that has an interest to fight precarity and to fight what generates precarity, these policies, and specifically the pressures of competitiveness and of the main driver of capitalism, let's say, the pursuit of profit, because we have sacrificed way too much for the sake of the pursuit of profit.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So my hope is my hope is in this alliance of social forces that cuts across the class divide.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big shift. That could be a big shift, but we need the right political forces to political leadership to respond to that available opportunity, that potential.
Right. What factors contribute to the understanding of peculiar nature of the most recent populist upsurge, in particular in Europe?
So I find that populism nowadays indeed has a very specific nature, because economic insecurity is its main grievance, even when it is expressed as xenophobia, as this hatred of foreigners. It is not so much cultural xenophobia, but economic. So this fear of job loss. And if this fear is addressed, then we have reasons to hope that people would not be so scared of the big ideas of progressive reform, as we see now, for instance, in the farmers' movement. I find that this farmers protest across Europe is very telling exactly of the fact that what is grieving people is insecurity. Because if you listen to the farmers, what they're complaining about is incapacity to cope under the pressures of more and more regulations from the European Commission, more competition with cheap imports from Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. So these are the grievances about incapacity to cope with the pressures. And this is actually when the link to populism, when you are under such pressures, your horizon of thinking shrinks to the here and now. So you lose your capacity to think ahead and capacity for solidarity, because you have to save yourself first. So this introvertness and this loss of perspective for the future is this permanent crisis management in which people are put as a result of precarity, is making them to support leaders who promise very quick shortcuts into security, into solving their problems. So stop immigration, put more political and military security, because economic reforms actually take time.
Mm.
So this is the link between populism and the precarity. So I define populism as or precarity. Sorry, precarity as responsibility without power. As I explained, we have more responsibility and less power to deliver on those responsibilities. And if you think about it, if you flip it around, what is the opposite of that? It is power without responsibility. This is autocracy. This is exactly what the populist leadership is. So these two things are the sides of the same coin, if you wish. And interestingly, that wave of anyway, I think I've explained that.
All right. You argue that, and I quote, what is being currently demonized in the mainstream media as populism can be seen, therefore, not as a transient expression of discontent, but as an expression of broadly shared and lasting anxiety triggered by perceptions of physical insecurity, political disorder, cultural estrangement, and employment insecurity. The question is, first, why do you think populism has been demonized in the mainstream media? Secondly, why do you think it is not transient?
Well, I think pundits and journalists and journalist academics have made us a very bad a favor by creating this negative connotation of populism. Why? I cannot say why. I cannot answer why, but I observed that this has happened. Now, initially, populism was not a negative label. For instance, take the U.S., the People's Party in the U.S. in the late 19th century, known as the Populist Party, or simply the Populists. It was a left-wing agrarian political party with a rather progressive agenda. They wanted gradual income tax, collective bargaining, a shorter work week, federal-controlled warehouses. So the typical, taking care of the people. Populism is taking care of the people. And actually, I find it's very hypocritical, because if you look at if populism is equated with giving political promises you cannot fulfill, look at our centrist parties. I mean, they keep promising us to take care of greening the economy, of the ecological crisis, and to serve the prosperity for all. Everybody knows that this is just not possible, because the green transition is going to demand enormous resources. So if that is not populism, I don't know what is. So this label is not helpful to identify where the problems are. And it is not transient, because it's been happening. The rise of what we call populism has been around for 30 years. It drew attention to analysts with the financial crisis in 2008, but it had already these unconventional parties, anti-establishment protest, started to rise in the 90s. And that was a decade of economic prosperity, but also of big destabilization because of all these neoliberal policies of privatization, deregulation, etc. So our Western societies were affluent but increasingly unstable. So this tendency, and my first analysis of that was written in 2003, so much before, and published in 2004, much before the economic meltdown of 2008. And I was observing, how actually it took the shape of very unorthodox anti-establishment protest that combined elements of left policies and right-wing fears, reactions to cultural estrangement, exactly those four items of the of a new agenda of people's grievances. So political disorder, physical insecurity, cultural estrangement, and employment insecurity, which cannot be defined as either left or right, in fact.
You suggest that we should stop using the lazy and misleading label populism. Why do you think the term populism is misleading? What do you propose instead?
Yeah, so it's misleading because it's preventing us to see the real changes in the ideological map of people's orientations. You know, how, at least for ordinary voters, the left and the right doesn't make much sense anymore. And let me explain that. So the real divides are no longer between, so on the left typically has been regulated economy, on the right, free market economy, right? And then culturally, liberal values versus traditionalism. If you look at any of those formations that are forming this insurgency now, they combine. So the narrative is not regulated versus free economy, but open versus closed economies. So open to the global market versus closed from the global market. So it's not about intervention in the economy of the state or how much privatization will have or not. It is about protecting our capitalism against global capitalism. And on the other side are those who still believe in global integrated capitalism because they're reaping the benefits of it. So I prefer, looking from the point of view of voters, not left, right, but opportunity risk is the big divide in people's perceptions. So am I to be afraid of these reforms, of the neoliberal policy set, or do I profit from it? And people increasingly, as I said, they increasingly are the losers of it. So in terms of cultural values, and in terms of social agenda, it's a mix. Therefore, so on the opportunity side, we embrace, or voters embrace, the benefits of global economy, IT. The efficiency of the IT revolution, but on the risk side, we see people demanding more and more welfare protection, but for us, not for the strangers. What's called welfare nationalism. So they also culturally, a lot of the opposite, the flagship of the far right opposition to Islam is actually justified as a protection of our liberal values. For instance, because Islam is presented as traditionalist, so we defend women's rights, homosexual rights. Pim Fortuyn. You take Pim Fortuyn, the first populist leader in the Netherlands, he was a homosexual person. Trump rages against now Wall Street and the globalists. So there is this mixture of social protection and cultural protection of our Western liberal values, but in an exclusionary way, because of these fears of and the pressures with which people cannot cope. Yes, so just shortly to answer your question, it's a lazy term. Populism is a lazy term because it prevents us from seeing how the left-right divide, through which for many centuries now, at least for 2 centuries, people have been making sense of the ideological divides. It's being replaced by a new divide, and this is opportunity versus risk. And on the side of opportunity, actually, you see a mixture of the former left and right, and on the side of risk, you also see a mixture of left and right values and preferences.
All right. How do you define the Ataka party in your native Bulgaria? Is it a populist or a racist party?
Okay, so Actually, you are asking me if we drop the term populism, or how shall we talk about these parties? Well, most of the parties that are being labeled populist in a negative sense are simply nationalist. You know, they want the welfare state for us, at the exclusion of others. And there's white supremacism there. So I would say, yes, let's call them nationalists. To take Ataka, you take the example of Ataka in my native Bulgaria. It is a nationalist. Clearly, I would call it a nationalist, but because it has a left-wing critique of globalization, which is clearly racist. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I would rather call it nationalist rather than populist.
All right. And our last question, how concerned are you about a possible explosion of far-right party support in the upcoming European Parliament elections?
Well, I am concerned, of course, but not surprised. I believe that sweeping victory of far-right parties. It's a trend that began in 2004, the European elections in 2004, and populist support to populist or to far-right parties actually has been growing, and I would blame that on the centrist parties who simply they refused to listen to the popular concerns.
All right, Professor Azmanova, thank you so very much.
My pleasure.